welcome to Doomer Optimism. Um, Ashley's here. I'm James. Um, and we are with Jimmy Tobias, who is a longtime, not in-person friend of mine, but someone who I feel close with because we talk a lot. And with whom I may actually start a podcast of our own someday. We have talked about this.
Yeah, we have. Yeah.
Um, so if nothing else, I'm delighted to get a chance to actually interview him. But Jimmy is most recently you've been working a lot for the Nation, right?
Yeah, the Nation, the Intercept are a couple big ones right now. Doing doing a big project for High Country News on like the federal grazing program.
Oh, okay.
Just a variety, you know.
Wow. Okay. I'd be curious to talk about the
Yeah,
current state
yeah.
of High Country News. We can. I'm curious about that. And so I guess Jimmy is like an actually talented investigative journalist, which candidly I'm not really. I'm more of a sort of I like to tell a fun story and stuff, and I like
Anthropologist.
I guess
Yeah.
what I'm saying is that Jimmy has the skills of someone in a kind of like old school gumshoe kind of way with the fedora and the little press card and the hat, where he is very good at document work. He's very good at like the sort
Yeah.
of bureaucratic,
I have some
legalistic.
good lawyers. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. That shapes our world. And so I thought it would be cool to bring you on and talk about environmental policy and how that might actually be changing um, in the Trump administration. And maybe, for some of our listeners who didn't follow this stuff as much, like in the post Chevron decision world, if that makes sense. So,
Yeah.
Jimmy, yeah, I don't know. Maybe if you wanted to start with this, like, uh, what do, how has the world changed post Chevron? Because I think a lot of people in the environmental sphere felt like that was going to be a decision that changed the world in really dramatic ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's still shaking out, but my sense of it has been that it kind of cuts both ways. You know, like these federal agencies that enforce like NEPA or the Endangered Species Act or the Clean Water Act, like when they make a really terrible decision, they can rely on Chevron to defend that decision. In the same way that like people, so I guess it depends. So, like if say like they deny protections to endangered species that really needs them, like they have been able to rely on something like Chevron to allow that decision to stand up in court. So, it cuts both ways. Like it might be easier to challenge those kinds of decisions, but on the other hand, if you're a developer and they rule against you, it might, you know, be easier for you. So it just kind of depends on like the particular situation. And I don't think we really have a clear sense of how it's all going to shake up. Obviously, like a lot of people in the environmental community are really concerned about the fall of Chevron and what it might mean for them. But I've definitely heard dissenting voices as well that like this could be a benefit in some cases. It'll just open up. I feel like in some ways it might like open up the ability to challenge the federal government in general, and so it could help in certain situations. But it's all kind of hypothetical, and unless we're talking about a specific case.
Can you explain like just how have things worked before Chevron and now what's different? Just
Yeah,
to
or
back
even
up
like
a bit.
what Chevron
Yeah,
deference
it's
is.
a court
Yeah.
precedent that that really gave a lot of deference to federal agencies and federal expertise
Mm.
in in their decisions around a whole variety of issues. But it really, where I'm aware of it is in the environmental realm. And so, if like a agency said, our scientists say this, and so we don't need to protect this animal. And I cover wildlife, I cover public lands. Like those are some of the areas that I'm most focused on. And so when an agency was, our scientists say this, so we don't need to protect this species, even though there's all this other evidence maybe that points to the need to protect that species, then the court tended to defer to agency expertise. That's
Okay.
my understand of kind of the layman's.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my like layman's understanding of what Chevron meant in many ways.
Mm.
Um,
And
and so
so
yeah, I feel like it's open like as with this whole like Trump era, there's just like a lot of things that are sort of being opened up that like have been set in stone for so long, and it's hard to know exactly how it's going to shape up. It's like the Roe v. Wade decision, like it's still shaking out. No one really knows um,
Well,
exactly what the final form's going to take.
yeah, and I think part of it too is like, at least the way I understand these things. And I was just talking to somebody. I can't believe I found somebody who worked in like fish and wildlife at a party across my alley in south side of Chicago. But anyways, he was telling me like about this, and it was like, well, on the one hand, like you can understand how maybe bureaucrats are entrenched actors in ways that could maybe even like perpetuate, like corporate interests, depending on what the issue is, whatever it is,
Definitely.
they're like, and then but then you push it into like the outside of the public realm or in outside of the bureaucrats, and like that's just so chaotic. Who knows what these different experts are and what their real incentives are, like. So we were just talking with
That's
Jimmy and I
interesting.
right before we started. It was like it's all just so chaotic. You don't really know, and who's on what side. Like, is the left for the bureaucrats? Even though sometimes the bureaucrats reify all these like corporate interests. You know what I mean? Where it's like, it's all just so hard to say and confusing. It's not really
Yeah,
a question.
it's interesting. Like I've covered the Interior Department mostly, and all the various agencies within that department. It's a huge, powerful agency. The Fish and Wildlife Service is controlled by Interior, the Bureau of Land Management, the National Park Service, most offshore drilling, like the USGS, which does a lot of scientific research. And there's a ton of great people in those agencies,
Yeah.
especially like on the ground, like the scientists and the biologists and the rangers. Like generally, my experience has been that those people really want to do what's right, and try really hard, but that often at the top of these agencies, with sort of these entrenched career bureaucrats who are plugged into the political realm, like they often that's kind of the level that can often be like captured,
Yeah.
by maybe corporate interests or whatnot. It depends what agency you're looking at. And so, shaking that up a little bit is not necessarily a bad thing. I would question, like, the Trump administration, for example, the kind of people they're going to replace them with. I don't know, and if that necessarily is going to be helpful. It just depends on the agency. I think, in some places, like I also have been covering the NIH a little bit. I think what is happening there could be kind of interesting, but with the Interior Department agencies, at least based on the last Trump administration, they have tended to be very, they brought in corporate lobbyists and industrial lobbyists and that type of individual to run these agencies. And they had a lot of scandals, and there was a lot of like corrupt behavior. And it'll be really interesting to see if this second time around they follow the same playbook, or if they take a different path. I mean, this Interior Department nominee seems pretty like middle of the road.
Yeah, we're wondering
Governor.
about that. We're gonna
Yeah.
ask several different people about that, their take.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. What is
My
your
sense is
take?
it could have been a lot worse.
Okay.
um, that he seems like, obviously he's pro oil and gas drilling and all that stuff that you would expect, but he's not like some like ideological fanatic who wants to like sell off all the public lands and like, uh, you know, um, destroy the conservation edifice. And there were people that they could have chosen that do want that. I mean, there are elements within, especially within the Republican Party, that do want that. But I get the sense, and I will be honest, I haven't dug too much into him yet. I'm kind of waiting to January to do that. But
Yeah.
when I can start filing FOIA requests, once they're in office, then,
And how,
but
like, and what is, so I'm so not tapped into federal politics to know this, but like, what was the last Interior Department secretary like, and in the Biden administration, and h- what is
in
the,
Biden's
yeah,
administration, it
yeah,
was Deb Haaland who, was a congresswoman from New Mexico, and she was like the first Native American to lead the department. So a lot of people cheered that. I think she was pretty boilerplate
okay,
Democrat,
right.
like they made some good decisions, they made some bad decisions. They mostly like went along, with the inertia of the bureaucracy, I
Yes.
would
I
say.
mean, we were saying this right before we started, but it's almost like it feels like, and this is a conversation we've had like, five different times recently, which is it feels like with the Dems, you get business as usual. And with Trump, it's just kind of like chaotic in the sense that there's all this momentum, like maybe we're getting bison nationalism, maybe we're getting like a regen ag future, or maybe we're getting like drill baby drill, like
Yeah, that I mean
world.
it's interesting. I mean, for me, like I focus on like very specific animals, like Florida panthers and red wolves and sage grouse and salmon, and I am not optimistic about
Mhm.
what the Trump administration is going to do in very like specific cases. I also would be very surprised if they did anything like bison nationalism because in general, the governors of Montana and Wyoming have absolutely zero interest in that, in my experience, because of the brucellosis thing and the cattle ranchers don't want bison coming near their cows.
Mm.
But maybe so. It would be nice. It would be really cool if like a second like Teddy Roosevelt showed up or whatever.
Yeah,
Um, I'm not anticipating
that's the
that, but
fantasy at least.
yeah, right. I know. But
So let's,
it'll, yeah.
oh, well, I was going to say, let's just for the sort of casual observer of the federal environmental regulatory structure, maybe let's start with both Chevron and this kind of new Trump thing where they're coming in and really trying this time to like break up the federal bureaucracy in a way that is much more systematized than it was last time. Like this time they've got a plan, they've got ideas of what they're going to do. This whole regulatory state that we talk about a lot, like I think actually talking about it through an environmental lens is kind of perfect because on the one hand it's like not anybody's high priority in terms of matters of state at the moment, but also I think for people who haven't followed the sort of regulatory history of environmental policy in the last, let's say, 30 years, or at least since mid 80s, like you kind of developed a thing where maybe a little surprisingly, if you think about it historically, what ended up happening was environmentalists, broadly speaking, got really into the regulatory agencies and using regulatory power as a way of preserving environmental health. And it sort of became an ideological thing in the sense that a lot of people sort of defaulted to more regulation, more government was better. And just sort of on the other side, partly for cultural reasons, because a lot of this stuff happens in the West and you had this kind of Western libertarian thing, people sort of defaulted to agencies and regulations are bad. And this became this like whole cultural stew of like anger and like people hated things that are under interior, like the Bureau of Land Management. They came to hate the Forest Service. And this goes back to all of this stuff that like, I'm sure, Jimmy, you could give us like an amazing history of. I could sort of do it too, but let's skip it a little bit. But like the wars in the woods in the Pacific Northwest, and then the use in particular, and let's be sure to get to these things, but the use in particular of things like the National Environmental Protection Act, NEPA. I always get some of these
Policy Act, but
Policy Act. There we go. And then in particular, the Endangered Species Act, which is, I think, one of perhaps the strongest, like in terms of like actual levers of power that you can use, it is one of the most far-reaching regulatory tools that exists in the American state. Like just because it tends to supersede pretty much any other concern. So if you want to develop your big town and someone comes in and says, no, there's actually a little flower out there in that desert, you can't put a subdivision there, ESA is going to supersede that.
Yeah.
And so it became a really, really powerful tool. And this ended up being something that a lot of people on the right in the business community, stuff like this, really hated. And then Chevron, this, sort of like court precedent that we're talking about, ended up playing into this because it presupposed that we would give deference to the agency rulings over, or let's say it presupposed that if an expert in an agency said this is how it should be, we would give deference to that unless there was good reason not to do it, right? So now all of a sudden we have Chevron being overturned and this group coming in and saying we're going to blow up the regulatory state. And now we're not going to, the regulators aren't going to decide how we do stuff in the world, right? So we're sort of looking at, through the lens of environmental policy, an entirely new landscape potentially. And Jimmy, you're a great person to sort of talk to about this stuff because I think you have good perspective both on the ups and downs of some of the regulatory stuff and a good perspective on how sometimes government and agencies are not fully telling us the truth about a lot of things. And so, just as a sort of introduction to your work a little bit, I was wondering if we could talk both about your work on endangered species and also maybe your work on lab leak stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, there
Because
is
you've
sort of
been
a
doing
strange
both.
nexus with the
Yeah, totally.
animals, you know.
Yep.
Yeah, I think with the people call NEPA like the environmental Magna Carta. Um, because really all it does is it when a federal agency takes a major action, maybe it's permitting like a transmission line or filling in some wetlands or something, then that action has to go through an environmental review process so that the public can learn about what the impacts are going to be.
Yeah.
So like most of the projects that go through NEPA go through much like very not very intensive reviews. Because they're not viewed as being super, they're not going to have a super huge impact on the human environment. But the big ones go through an EIS, an environmental impact statement, which can take like a couple years or longer in some cases. Um, and so that delay is what really pisses off
Mhm.
developers and other people, is that it adds time to the project. There's costs associated with the project, but NEPA itself doesn't really have the power to like shut down a project forever. Most of the time, at most, it will do is like delay it, and maybe there'll be litigation and that'll delay it a little further. But the point of the law is so people know what's going on, so they know that if that transmission line is going to wipe out an endangered species or pollute the water or whatever. But as part of that process, like the Endangered Species Act is also often brought in if a project's going to impact um, either an endangered species itself or its habitat. And the EIS does have teeth, and it can shut down a project, although that almost never happens.
So just to put it really simply, for example, NEPA for a big project could require you to perform an EIS, environmental impact statement,
Mhm.
that could then discover that you would be impacting endangered species and then could shut down a project, right? So it's not just
Yes.
because, and I say that because, for example, those of us who are on Twitter may have seen there was a big thing that where like right wing, like pro like American dynamism kind of guys were getting really mad about the fact that recently there was a discovery of some rare earth minerals in Montana. I don't know if you guys saw this. And somebody did this like mega viral post being like, look, environmentalists are already circling to shut this down. And I went and looked at actually what it was. And it was a letter co-signed by a bunch of environmental groups saying, hey, this is probably a large enough potential mineral development to trigger a NEPA EIS. So we, the undersigned, are hoping for an EIS. And I thought, well, guys, like, that's not environmentalists circling the wagons to try to shut
Yeah.
down your mind. Like, let's be clear about this. This is actually probably potentially beneficial if you live in Montana. Don't you want to have an EIS before you do a big rare earth mineral mine? And so I think people can kind of get lost in some of this.
Yeah, I mean, the environmental regulations do cost money and take time. And so that's what I think ultimately people are pissed about. They don't want to spend money on these things, and they don't want it to take time. And they certainly don't want like a flower to shut down their project. But that kind of thing almost never happens. Like the amount of times, so when the Endangered Species Act is going to shut down your project, it leads the Fish and Wildlife Service, which administers the law, to issue a jeopardy opinion. And if you get a jeopardy opinion on your project, you're in big trouble. But that, like, there have been a lot of studies about this. That almost never happens. Never. Even if, like, the Fish and Wildlife Service, as I've just, in my experience reporting on this agency, it is like a relatively toothless agency at this point, very susceptible to political pressures, very unlikely to shut down a project. There is judicial review, and so these environmental groups will sue, and that's where things get hairy. But the agency itself is like rarely, it's like not going to shut down your project. You might get sued, but these species are like are held in trust on behalf of the American people. once they're gone, they're never coming back. Like
Right.
we have, like it is in the American public's interest to preserve these species and not let them go extinct. And so, Congress has recognized that as like a extremely high priority for the federal government. And there are definitely people who would like to get rid of the Endangered Species Act, and they're already gunning for NEPA, because at the end of the day, they don't want the costs. They don't want the costs, but it wouldn't just imagine if someone was building like a giant transmission line through your neck of the woods. Like you'd kind of want to know how that was going to impact like water quality, the local wildlife. Like that's what they wanted to get rid of. And I think it's a very short-sighted. This country is like so powerful, so rich. We build so many amazing things, and I think most people who are like pro-America want that to continue. But NEPA and the Endangered Species Act are not the things that are standing in the way, you know? Like those are not the heart of the issue. So I just think it's like misdirected. So some of this anger is misdirected to kind of push an agenda that maybe they don't want to articulate outright.
Do you think there's any truth to, or maybe not in these particular mechanisms, but like the sense that environmentalism has just become this like bureaucratic box checking exercise to write a report on the carbon emissions of, X, Y, or Z, or like the sustainable development goals? At least I see this in my work a lot, where people are like the measurement of the sustainable development goals is the environmentalism, and it's so out of touch with the reality of like anything that like approaches ecology or like an ecological ethic, that people are like sick of that kind of thing. Is there any aspect of that going on in this, or is that just kind of like people put that onto these different mechanisms just because they see it in different places?
I feel like the environmental movement is so big and diffuse that like there's definitely like, there's definitely a lot of bureaucratic. I don't know. I don't even know how to describe it. Like a lot of it's like super bureaucratized, I guess you
Yeah.
could
Or
say.
it's like report writing and spreadsheets.
Yeah,
Like it's like
spreadsheet brain,
it's
as you like
yeah,
to say.
spreadsheet brain. It's just like measuring impact is the environmentalism, rather than doing something action oriented, or, like I don't know. I'm describing it poorly, but I think about like just stop oil. It's like this diffuse anger based on measurement of carbon in the atmosphere, but it's not like doing anything positive in the actual ecology, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, like even NEPA to some extent you could describe that way. Like really at the end of the day, it's like checking boxes because it's not going to stop the project per se. It's just
Mm.
going to describe what the impacts are so the public knows. And I think there is value in like transparency like that, even if it
Yeah.
doesn't like necessarily, you know, preserve, if it doesn't necessarily like help. I mean, it does
Change the
protect.
actual, yeah,
Yeah,
change the
yeah.
actual
Usually,
flow.
often it doesn't change. Sometimes it does change things around the edges, but rarely does a project like radically completely change, I think.
Unless the
Um,
Endangered Species Act is brought in.
Unless, yeah, and even then, that's like such a rare occurrence. But um, so yeah, I do think there's definitely a lack of vitality within the environmental agencies themselves. I think there's still vitality on the outside, but like the environmental movement is fractured and
Mm,
weird, and we were kind of talking about this earlier, but like,
yep.
even like there's a lot of controversy over all this renewable energy, like this industrial scale renewable energy development
Yes.
that's going on in like the Western deserts. Um, and a lot of environmental groups, because they're so maniacally focused on climate change, like or like whatever, it seems like a lot of people are just like, and we'll do anything. But like obviously, like if you've seen one of these solar farms, or and so why I keep bringing up this like the transmission line example, because I'm working on a story about a transmission line. But if you see what it does to the desert, you wouldn't, as an environmentalist, you probably would be like, yikes,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and
Well, but it
Yeah.
sounds like you're saying that there should be this kind of like box checking thing is a problem because it doesn't go far enough in actually changing the or protecting the ecology, or it should go slightly further. Like I almost feel like people see the bureaucratic thing and think like just get rid of all of it, but like the protection is a good thing. Like clean water is a good thing. The protection of these species is a good thing. Like just because it's turned into this weird bureaucratic thing doesn't mean you should just get rid of it. It means you should turn it into something more useful and less bureaucratic and less like box checking and more actually protecting ecologies or making developers act in a certain way as to protect the water or soil or
it would be nice if these regulations were not necessary. I think like it'd be nice if we didn't have if there wasn't this like sort of punitive bureaucratic approach to like saving endangered species. At the time of the Endangered Species Act, like so many species were in such bad shape that like it did make a big difference in keeping them alive. And I think a lot of species are like back from the brink and they get delisted. And so there is a mechanism for these laws to kind of like release some of their stranglehold, like when the species gets delisted and it's recovered. But and I think maybe this gets at what you're saying. Like the problem with the Endangered Species Act, as I see it, is it's really good at keeping a species from going like completely extinct, but it's not very good at actually recovering the species, like doing the bison nationalism thing and actually bringing a species back onto the landscape in like a robust way. It's not very good at that. I mean, there are cases, of course, of that kind of success, but it's not very good at that. And that takes a different vision that doesn't seem to be
compatible with bureaucracy. Really, you need to be more
compatible with the bureaucracy, but also compatible with like the current state of the environmental movement, or like there doesn't seem to be like a broad-based movement to do that kind of thing that has like traction with the American public at this time. I don't know.
Well, if it comes from anywhere, it'll come from us, right?
Yeah, I hope.
Let me throw this kind of big picture kind of, if you were to, maybe if I'm going to ventriloquize like the American dynamism people who are into this kind of like TR idea of conservation, but also like strong America and stuff like this. I think they're a problem with the bureaucratic superstructure of this. And I guess this is like a thing I've perceived just watching it and wondering like what the long-term goals are, is that when you take something like the Center for Biological Diversity, which is like an organization that we could talk about, like we could do a whole podcast about, and I think it's a very complicated organization, but arguably they're like the legal arm of what used to be the Earth First movement. And arguably they're kind of, they're a well-designed, very professionalized group of people who basically share the views of people who are pretty anti-development and almost anti-technology in some ways, in ways that I'm sympathetic to in a lot of ways. So this is not to call them out or something. But if you look at the aggregate of the way that they work and the aggregate of the way that a lot of Western environmental groups work, like what ends up happening is that you use lawsuits, whether deploying ESA or other things. For example, up, where I write about a lot and live a lot, in a place where the Northwest Forest Plan has kind of like reshaped life based in theory just on the spotted owl, on preserving habitat for the spotted owl, caused this huge regulatory agreement that basically shut down public lands logging in the Northwest, and shut down industries over there. And the question that I think a lot of people would have, and that I don't really know how to solve, is like, what you do when you stop the mine here in the US. And like a lot of times you're saying like, I'm not anti-mining, but just this mine in this spot is not the right spot. And then you sue and then you delay and then eventually it becomes so expensive that it just doesn't happen. That's often the unstated goal. Or you say like, we're just trying to preserve the spotted owl. We want the loggers to keep logging in a sustainable way, but actually weirdly, like every time they try to apply for, at least to cut that section of timber, we're going to sue. And you sue to the point that people just stop bothering. And then it just goes away. And the big picture question would be, okay, so that means all our mining and all our development and all our factories and all that stuff that's going to get sued and prevented just goes to somewhere else. We didn't stop actually producing all the stuff. We didn't stop using the resources. We didn't stop like actually being a highly industrialized economy. Our industrialization is just out somewhere else. Our minerals are out somewhere else. And so like there's a problem of vision in a certain way. Like, because if I was to guess, I would say a lot of environmentalists coming from that school of thought actually would just prefer there wasn't that much mining in general, that there was less resource use, less energy use, less use of the stuff that comes from this kind of highly technologized society in general. But you're kind of obfuscating it with this lawfare and this bureaucracy. And so you're playing a game that's actually not really honest with the American people. And I think there's a version of people maybe on the right or maybe pro development or whatever, however you want to describe them, who get very frustrated with that. Do you think that's a fair way of looking at the problem, which is a problem I don't know how to solve absent us using less resources and less energy?
I think it's such an interesting, it is an interesting conundrum. I mean, I had a few thoughts that pops in my head as you were kind of describing that. I mean, one is that like what we're really talking about is federal lands. You know, um, if you want to buy up a forest and on private land in Alabama or wherever, no one's really stopping you. It would cost a lot of money, and your timber probably wouldn't be very affordable at this stage. Although there's a lot of like legacy private timber farms all over the place. And same with a mine, really. I mean, you know, if it wasn't on federal land, there would probably be less stringent regulations. But what we're talking about is, you know, publicly managed wildlife on publicly owned land that the
Yeah.
American people get to decide what happens there.
Well, although let me stop you. That's actually not true. If I want to build a subdivision and there's a flower, I'm offering this specific
Yes,
example because that near where I live in California,
yes.
there's a huge ranch development that they're trying to make where there are a couple rare flower species, and they're just that's the tool that people are using to prevent that development.
Yes, totally. I'm just saying, I was just thinking of like the, like the broad scale
Yeah.
timber cutting and the mines in particular. Like especially out west, those things tend to be like connected to federal lands. And so there's sort of like an extra layer of like democratic process that gets applied. But you're right, the Endangered Species Act can apply to your backyard, and people bring laws, people get up in arms about that a lot. I don't have an answer either. Like, I want this country to be strong and prosperous, but I also happen to think like our conservation system, as I said to Ashley earlier, is like one of the greatest, most dynamic cr creations of this country and should be protected and lifted up as an example of the country's greatness. And, obviously that can clash with like extractive use and things like that. And there's a lot of heated debates. But in general, I'm like a fan of the democratic process that gets applied to our management of public lands and wildlife. And even though it's messy and contentious and there's a lot of conflict, like the fact that we all have a voice in it and like these lands and animals are like held, are managed on our behalf by the government. I think that's a much better outcome than some of the people out there right now in the Republican Party who would like to sell off all the federal lands, or get rid of the North American conservation model, get rid of the Endangered Species Act. I mean, I think the system we have now, though it is contentious and has flaws, is a lot better than some of the alternatives. And but that's not to say that there haven't been policy mistakes in the past or bad outcomes necessarily. Though I think in general, like if you look at like polls of American institutions that are popular, like the ESA is very popular, the public lands are very popular, and I think it's because people recognize how special they are and how you just don't, there's not a lot of other places in the world you can go and have and find what you find here. But I didn't answer your question, but it went on sort of propaganda for public lands and wildlife. But
Well,
that's like my overall approach. That's my overall like
yeah.
thinking when I think about these issues. Even though in discrete cases it's obviously much thornier.
So can you, I mean, I know this is tough, and I know none of us can really know what's coming down the pipe. But can you give us maybe your gut picture of what we're going to see under a Trump administration that might not be radical in the way that we would have thought of like a really radical right-wing administration in the model of Reagan or Bush, where it's just like development at all costs and that kind of thing. It doesn't, in a certain way, that doesn't actually seem to be the priority of the Trump administration. But they do talk all the time about drill, baby, drill, which
Hmm.
I take to mean leases on federal land above all.
Hmm.
Mm.
And they talk about blowing up regulations that, impede Americans starting businesses and stuff, which could, focus heavily on environmental regulations. Do we have a sense of like what we might see in this coming administration under Doug Burgum, under who's the EPA? Sorry, who's the EPA?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been thinking about like, I think there's a lot of areas where like the Trump administration might be a breath of fresh air. And I think foreign policy, like I'm cautiously optimistic that thing because like the Biden administration seems to have been a disaster. I think the what's happening at like the health agencies, it could be interesting. I kind of circling back for a second before I answer that on the interior front, like I've been doing a lot of investigations around where COVID came from and FOIAing the National Institutes of Health and trying to get documents out of that agency that could shed light on what happened because it really does remain an open question what the origin of the virus was with
Can you tell
conflicting
us a little
reports.
bit about this? Because you did like a cover story for The Nation about this and things like that. You really went a lot deeper than probably almost any mainstream reporter in sort of pursuing this story.
Yeah, well, the reason is because I got all these like FOIA records that were like pretty eye-popping, and what they showed was like in January 2020, like before most of us had probably even heard of COVID, a bunch of very high-profile virologists emailed Dr. Fauci, and basically were like, it looks like this virus could have, come out of a lab.
Mm.
Um, and they organized this like hasty conference call. And basically I got the emails that set up this call in the aftermath of the call, and the Congress had been trying to get them, and like somehow these amazing lawyers I work with in Chicago managed to get them before really anybody else, unredacted at
Nice.
least. And so they talked in this conference about like the things that made them suspicious about the provenance of the virus, and one of the main things was that it had this like genetic feature in it called a furin cleavage site, which is sort of technical, and I'm no scientist, but that was one of the things in the virus that really freaked them out because other SARS-related coronaviruses don't have
Hmm.
this feature. Um, but anyway, at the end of the day, this group of scientists, not very long after this teleconference with Fauci and Francis Collins, the head of the NIH, and others, published a paper that said, the main conclusion was that we don't think a lab leak is plausible. And they say, oh, they just follow the science. Other people think it was a cover up. I won't litigate that. But it was later discovered that a group that the United States that had applied for a grant at DARPA, the
Hmm.
DoD agency, had proposed partnering with the Wuhan Institute of Virology to insert the fear and cleavage sites into coronaviruses that had been collected from all over China and Southeast Asia. And so when people saw that, obviously that was kind of mind blowing because this virus had this feature that everyone thought was really weird. And there had been a proposal that didn't end up getting funded, but there had been a proposal floating out among these high level virologists to do these kind of work by like, inserting these features into coronavirus in Wuhan. So people, obviously people were like, that is very unusual. And from the beginning of the pandemic, the reason people thought it might have come out of the lab was because there was a lab there that was like one of the top coronavirus research labs in the world. So, there's this circumstantial evidence around a lab origin. The Energy Department, with low confidence, has said they believe it's a lab origin, and the Energy Department is probably our government agency with like the highest level of scientific expertise. The
Mm.
FBI has said with moderate confidence that they think it's a lab origin. A bunch of other agencies have said they think it comes from nature. So there's definitely this like continued split. There's partisans on both sides who are
Mhm.
absolutely convinced one way or the other. I'm not really convinced one way or the other, but I do think continued investigation is necessary, and I'd like to see like the documents in NIH. And I think that the Trump administration might be more transparent around this issue, but we'll
Hmm.
see. Um,
Mm.
And so just sort of, I mean, thematically linked, even if it's not topically linked, like, I think part of what pisses people off about the quote unquote regulatory state is this kind of feeling that like there's a set of people, some of whom are not in government but are close with scientists and bureaucrats who are in government, who are having these conversations in rooms that we don't have access to. And I think you and I, Jimmy, having worked so much on public lands in the West, might dispute that a little bit, like in the sense that like a lot of the times like people are like, oh, this all happened and I had no say over it, and actually there were a million public meetings and there were a lot of chances to submit stuff, and some of that's just, in my opinion, wrong. Like some of that's like, man, like, I'm sorry that they put out a notice, you really just weren't paying attention. But especially at the kind of like higher global levels where you're talking about, Obama directing the EPA to suddenly sort of be the agency that decides what we do, big picture on climate change, in a way that like maybe didn't feel that democratic. Like you couldn't pass the law and then suddenly you're like, all right, EPA is just going to do this stuff. Um, and then, not necessarily directly downstream of that, but I don't have the energy or time necessarily to look at every solar farm they're putting on every part of the Mojave Desert. But I did just drive up, I don't know, I guess I was going to Wyoming, and I woke Antonia up as we were driving to say like, hey, this is the first valley where you saw a pronghorn antelope. So like, do you want to look and let's see some pronghorns again? And it was papered over with solar panels.
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
And
I
I was
know.
like,
Yeah.
whoa, wait, what? Like, no, hold on. And I know that, there's a conflict here. Like, I know that there are people who are like working for what's it called? The Amargosa Conservancy, who are, you know, kind of coming out of that very lefty, activisty, sort of earth firsty kind of left wing enviro thing, who are very upset and who feel like this is happening a lot faster than they had any choices about, and are feeling like basically the Biden administration put this forward
Yeah.
through regulatory agencies, not through a democratic process. Um, and like, I'm wondering, I don't know, is there some kind of bull case in the Trump future where that might change? Or is this just all we have? Like, I don't really know how we're supposed to do this, but there's a version of it that feels a little Soviet. Like there's people who
Mm.
are just chosen as the experts and they're going to set the big picture tone. And we really don't have a ton of say over it because our Congress is so locked up that we can't push your congressman to get in there and give your voice as an elected representative.
Well, that does seem to be a major problem that the Congress is so useless, and they don't seem to be willing to exert control over these federal agencies. But even with the, I'm with you on the solar panel thing. I just wrapped up a story about it that is coming out, and but even with that, there was a mandate from Congress to build like 25 gigawatts
Mm.
of solar and wind on public land by like 2025. So like they do have direction from Congress, but obviously when you see it, you're like, Holy crap!"
Yeah.
Like, and even and the way they're doing it, I think, they just released this solar plan that opens like 30 million acres, or it makes available 30 million acres of federal land out west to solar, and
Can you
um,
actually just stop really quick and explain to people how that happened? Because that's been a big sort of talking point. But I'm not actually well versed on like.
Yeah, there had been a solar plan for the West that was established in 2012 that applied to 6 states out there, and yeah, I don't remember what the exact acreage is. I think it was like 20 million or something acres that were available for solar development in those 6 states, and then they just expanded the program to all the Western states except Alaska, and I guess Hawaii if you count that as a Western state, and it's like 30 million acres that are going to be available for solar development. Now, not all 30 million of those acres are going to get developed, turned into mirrors and all that, but it's a huge sea change coming to the deserts of the West, where they're going to be industrialized in a way that they have never been before in the name of fighting climate change, really. And I think it's happening very quickly. There's a lot of drama and conflict that's starting, and I think will only grow. There's other issues, like I care a lot about the sage grouse, which has like lost 40% of its population in the last 20 years. And a lot of these projects will likely be on sage grouse habitat, and this is a species that like kind of defines the West for a lot of people, and it's doing really poorly, and this is just another stressor. So there's just a lot of rapid change that seems to have bipartisan support. I remember vividly like the Wilderness Society, I remember like a couple years ago, like changed the little image above its website. Instead of just like mountains and rivers, it was like mountains and rivers with like a solar panel on it and like a
And like yeah,
windmill. And I
yeah.
was like, isn't this the Wilderness Society? Like what?
Will there be any like throttling of that? The specifically the renewable energy stuff under Trump? It's not, it's like it's weird because it's like I'm not against renewable energy, like, but just the speed and the industrial nature of it under the Dems just seems like totally psychotic, in relation to the underlying goals of ecological protection. And but before you answer that, I just want to mention to James at the last Wagon Box event there was some woman there who I think cornered Peter Allen, who is another person who's been on this podcast a bunch, and told him all this stuff about the 30 million acres. Or was it you and Peter both, James? I don't remember. And then
Yeah,
Peter
we'll
was like,
talk
she
about
just
that, yeah.
told me all this stuff, and then I looked it up, and she's right. And I like thought I'm getting ranted at by like a wild conspiracy theorist, and then it was like, wait, this stuff is actually happening, and this is like the kind of conversations we've been having behind the scenes. But yeah, do you see any throttling of this kind of like hyper industrial green future,
I
quote
was just
unquote?
thinking about this the other day. Trump did like have had some like gathering with like Latino voters in October, and he was like talking about like, oh, the solar farms, they're so ugly, they're crazy, they hurt the rabbits. He went on this like spiel about the solar farms, and like so maybe he will, and obviously he seems to have a thing against like wind in particular, like offshore wind. Um, so I think it's possible that they would like clamp down on some of this stuff, but and maybe like rewrite the solar plan, but I don't really see them like stopping projects that are already in the pipeline. There's already,
Mm,
I think there are more than 100 projects in the pipeline
mm,
out west. Um, big projects. So I don't really see them stopping those necessarily. Not all of them might make it through, but in general, my sense of the Trump administration is they're pro-development on all fronts when it comes to public lands. Um, and last time around they did everything they could to weaken protections for the sage grouse, to water down the ESA, to the only thing I'm hopeful is that they won't fall prey to these efforts to actually get rid of the federal lands, which, Utah just filed a lawsuit with the Supreme Court, hoping that it'll get picked up to actually get rid of the federal lands and let Utah take control of them. Um, the ones within its boundaries. I think it's probably a long shot lawsuit, but
Yeah.
um, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm too sanguine about this, but I mean, I've seen too many Western politicians run on this kind of for people who don't know, there was this kind of thing that emerged from these like sort of like oil and gas and mining backed Western legislators, a lot of people in Utah state legislatures, in Montana, Wyoming state legislatures, who were like really hot to trot on this thing. We're going to take these lands back. We're going to make them state lands and stuff. And like a shocking degree of the shocking number of those people just lost their seats. And like Jason Chaffetz in Utah, who was like a rising congressional star, tried to sell up relatively small parcels of BLM land in Utah, and just got chased right out of Congress, like real quick. He's like on TV, like hustling now, because it doesn't work out well for these people, because people in these states really, really love their lands. But the kind of sad flip side of this that I see is that, like, sort of in the recent years, like in the years of climate becoming this single-minded focus for a lot of these organizations on the more like environmental center left, is that like they've adopted a vision of public lands that sort of fits in with what the old school, more like capitalist vision was on the right, in the sense of like they've started to look at them as a resource for development, and a resource like this sort of like big body of open land out there that you can develop for the wind and the solar and this sort of thing, um, that sort of mirrors what the older capitalist vision of our public lands was, which is like as a basin and resource to be developed, so that we have this like this vast like untapped potential that we can go for. And then there's people who I think basically view the public lands as something that should be shut off and used as a store of essentially habitat. Um, and there's not a lot of people really pushing that vision of public lands anymore. Is that true? I mean, it seems to be at a high level.
Yeah, I mean, the public lands ever since like the Homestead Act went away and FLIPMA, closed that era, like they've always been they've been multiple use. Uh and so there's always been mining and logging, and some have always been preserved as parks, and some after the Wilderness Act became wilderness areas. Um, I do think that at a high level, there's not very many like conservation visionaries of like the old like Aldo Leopold, John Muir type
Mm-hmm.
that are at high levels of power in our country, or even Teddy Roosevelt. I think mostly it's people who are like kind of normie, multiple use people, or like hardcore, let's develop it all people. And then you have, groups like Center for Biological Diversity and some others that are like pretty hardcore on the protect it, preserve it side. But those people tend not to be the ones who are like leading, the conversation from positions of political power. Um, and so, the wilderness movement, like you don't hear about it much anymore.
I was
Uh,
just going to ask, can we actually stop you and talk about this? Because I think this is something listeners will have all a little bit perceived, right? Like the Sierra Club, I won't name him, but I was talking to somebody kind of like higher-ish up in the Sierra Club, coming from an older school version of the Sierra Club. And he was talking about how like he was like, from a high level, man, we're just not really allowed to talk about animals anymore. Like animals are kind of off the table at the Sierra Club now, because
What in the world?
it's about access, it's about bringing people into
Yikes.
and getting diverse people
Mhm.
out onto the
But
woods
like it
and
was
things
always
like
like a
that.
joke of environmentalism that like, charismatic megafauna is what we really like, what really moves the needle for people, you know?
I know a lot of that is kind of out. I mean, maybe Jimmy, you could probably speak to this more, but like, the wilderness movement, like I would tend to think that of all things, like wilderness areas are things that would be in danger going forward, because there's
Mm.
not a constituency like on either side for them at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it is something I'm like to me, the wilderness movement's like one of the greatest movements in American history. And when they more than anybody, kind of, I think, created the political ferment that got us to things like the Endangered Species Act or whatever. Like those like early public lands conservationists, and they sort of had like a like rugged pro-American like masculine cast to them. That is certainly missing from the modern
Bring it
environmental
back,
movement.
baby.
Yeah, but yeah, like you don't hear about it, and you do like you see it in local places. Like, I'll give you an example, like the Boundary Waters Wilderness, which is in northern Minnesota and is one of the oldest wilderness areas in the country, and is absolutely fantastic. Um, it is being, threatened by a copper and nickel mine next door to it in its watershed in the Superior National Forest. And there's this big fight over that. And I think, um, in this discrete issue, the Biden administration wanted to stop the mine. The Trump administration, which has been which has been heavily lobbied by this mining company, which is foreign owned, by the way, um, they're probably going to reverse Biden's decision and let this mine move
Mm.
forward. And to me, yeah, I don't know. To me, like that's, that's like one of our greatest wilderness areas, and it's really rather disturbing that we would like build a mine that's owned by a foreign company next to it. But, of course, if we didn't build the mine, you'd have people screaming about the federal bureaucracy like ruining their neighborhood or
Right.
whatever. So, it's like it's the same, it's the same thing we've heard, the same kind of fight that's always happening on these federal lands. But there is no um huge wilderness constituency. Ironically, like it seems like, like remember that big mine that was they wanted to build in Alaska in that salmon fishery? I'm
Yeah, the
forget
pebble mine.
Yes, the Pella line. Like, Don Jr. and Tucker Carlson came out against that mine.
Yeah.
And so that was sort of an interesting moment of like wilderness, cross-cultural, cross-partisan, like it had it had a resonance of that older kind of movement in that moment, but or backcountry hunters and anglers is another group that kind of has a little bit of that
Mm.
resonance, but it's not I mean, the wilderness movement was always a minority movement,
Yeah.
It just seems to have lost like purchase on the imagination of the public like it maybe it once had. But I really hope that changes.
In the interest of like the optimism part of the conversation of doomer optimism, I'm curious, like, okay, so we mentioned a couple things that are potentially cause for optimism and or could be tapped more thoroughly with some maybe more visionary perspectives. This wilderness, like this Tucker Carlson wilderness guy, is one thing. Against foreign investment is another thing. I think that there does exist a kind of like I don't know how big this constituency is because I'm sure my brain is warped from Twitter, but bison nationalism, like American dynamism around regenerative things. Like there was this huge push and continues to be this huge push. Like Joel Salatin and Thomas Massey are going to be at the Department of Ag and we're going to have a regen ag future. And like a bunch of people, like young men especially, were getting excited about this potential. And then I'm wondering, like, I don't know if maybe you want to talk, you mentioned at the beginning, but the High Country News and federal grazing program, like is there some movement here, or at least if we're talking about some vision that's potentially optimistic, we can will it into existence or at least name it here.
I remember seeing way back when like Earth First put out this they used to put out this journal, especially in the early days that was like written by kind of the original people. And I remember they published this vision of like creating these huge like parks in every region of the country. And I remember the one in like the like Midwest was going to be like full of bison and it was just going to be this like giant like prairie preserve. Obviously that has not come to pass. But like I think there are I think that the bison stuff's pretty interesting. And there are interesting movements there like that American Prairie Reserve and um uh like there seems to be a possibility that they could like be brought back on the landscape in more places. But uh I don't know, do you see like any kind of like mass movement building around like bringing back like major
I'm I'm
animals like
of
that?
the
Yeah.
I'm of the sort of like theory of change that it's kind of like it's an incremental thing where somebody proves something that's really dynamic and interesting and then other people see it. It's less like a theoretical, let's have bison. Okay, well, what would that mean like in
Hmm.
practice? But instead, like somebody does something really cool. Like we have this guy Peter Allen on the podcast. He's got Mastodon Valley Farm. His whole thing is like I am a keystone species. Like I, Peter Allen, am a keystone
Hmm.
species on my land. And that's the way he's got a PhD in ecology. And that kind of proves the model that then other people pick up and like more and more people are noticing. That's kind of the whole theory of the podcast. But what is the federal grazing program? Is that anything along the lines of these?
Well, the federal grazing program is very
Is it grazing on federal lands?
controversial. Yeah, it's grazing on federal land. It's like all things on federal lands, it's very controversial because of the impact on like because of a lot of it happens on like desert landscapes.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
uh,
I mean,
so
I'm so not well versed in the ecology of the West. This is you and James' wheelhouse, but I'm aware that there's a lot of like understory that needs to get cleared and a lot of that causes a lot of wildfires. And there are places where grazing managed well would be net positive for the ecology.
Yeah,
Is that
James,
what
what
we're
are your
talking about?
thoughts?
Well, yeah, I mean, so Ashley, and for everybody listening, I mean, the semi-complicated thing here being that like a lot of what we know as public lands are managed by the Bureau of Land Management that sort of like descend from these marginal grazing used lands that are not necessarily developed super well for like cows to be on. And
Mhm.
so we lived through years of this kind of like brutal, like war, like regulatory warfare that became kind of cultural warfare.
Mm.
About like sort of getting the line used to be cow free by 93, and the
Mm.
environmentalists wanted to get just all the cows off that land, right? But then that, particularly that well of BLM land, BLM and Forest Service land, was, as Jimmy mentioned earlier, designed for multiple use. It's a kind of unique American thing. There are public lands that, you know, you and I can go get a mining claim on. You and I can theoretically go get a ranching lease on, which kind of really can't happen anymore. And so I'm not actually sure what Jimmy was researching, but the point of this is that it's not just, hey, oh, let's add some cows somewhere, and or like that they will necessarily be beneficial. These are generally marginal desert lands. That's why
Okay.
they were unclaimed under the Homestead Act, and then they sort of reverted to federal. This gets really complicated. They reverted to what is now effectively federal ownership.
Mm.
Um, but until 1971 in the FLIPMA Act that he was mentioning before, it wasn't even really clear who owned them. They were like in public trust, but they didn't belong to nobody. There wasn't a deed to them. And so now they are effectively owned by the federal government, but like even that is a little obfuscated, and like guys in the West will often say that it's not technically ownership. So that's where a lot of these like legal cases come from and stuff like that. It's that they'll say it's not constitutionally legal for the federal government to technically own land. It gets very complicated, but this is where this comes from. Is the Federal Grazing Service doesn't exist anymore, right, Jimmy?
The BLM runs there.
Yeah.
Yeah, the BLM runs down there, and the Forest
It's the
Service runs around the
inheritor
correct.
organization of the Federal Grazing Service and stuff. So there's a lot of like carryover from stuff that was happening in the 20s that we never like really figured out perfect solutions to.
Mm.
And that not everybody, well, let's just put it in really simple terms. There was a movement to basically get rid of that entire system and just say like, hey, we're not going to have these ranchers anymore.
Mhm.
A few stubborn people remain. They're not like huge presences on the land. They're not huge presences in our national beef production industry, but symbolically speaking, they mean a lot. And to a certain degree, there's a version of speaking to what everything we're talking about. There's more than a few people who feel like the cows are what prevents all that development from happening. So you'll hear people in Montana say cows, not condos, right? And so there's
Mm.
this kind of idea that like it's a way of living such that you are interacting with the land, such that you are engaging with, and often people will say enriching the land,
Or stewarding, or yeah,
and
depending.
preventing that development that turns everything into bozeman. So this whole stew of conflict that I
That makes
assume
sense.
Jimmy is
Yeah.
working on.
Yeah, and we're in the very early stages, so I really don't have like opinions on it per se. But it is a very interesting system. There's kind of two kinds of permit holders in the federal grazing program. There's sort of the mom and pop. Then there's all these like huge companies and very
Mm.
wealthy families who own a lot of permits. Um, like the Simplot Corporation is one of the biggest. Um, and we're looking into sort of like how this program affects the health of the land based on like
Okay.
federal data, and who the big permittees are. Just trying to get basic information about the
Well,
program, which
you're
is
gonna have to
easy to
come
do.
back on once you
Yeah.
do that reporting with James and Peter Allen, and we can talk about this because we had a whole debate that was basically like future environmental policy, and we had to split it up by east and west because rainfall makes such a huge difference
Right,
on what you're
right,
dealing with the land. Like you can only handle
totally.
so many cows on the landscape in a dry, super dry environment, but in the east it's a totally opposite thing where you just have way too much forest growth and you have to like, fight it back. if you want to keep any kind of savanna ecosystem going. But you're gonna have to come back on and
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I
let
mean,
me ask you a wrap up question here, because I think this sort of goes to like a little bit of what the stew in our little community of people are sort of wrestling with. And I think some people come down one side or the other, harder or stronger, right? And certainly there are some people in this circle who saw Chevron getting overturned, saw Trump getting elected, and were like, okay, you're going to be able to freely put pig shit in the water and destroy the state of Iowa with no
yeah,
oversight.
yeah.
This is all going to go to hell. The Clean Air Act going away, Clean Water Act's going away. They're not going to have, these agencies are going to be completely toothless. This is all over. This sucks, right? Okay. That candidly isn't my opinion, if only because I don't think it's like their priority to fight them battles yet. Um, and then even I am a little guilty, I would say, of this kind of like contrarian, bullish vision. There was that whisper that Thomas Massie was going to get Secretary of Ag. That didn't happen. But Doug Burgum, our mutual friend Hal Herring, he texted me when Burgum got put in. He was like, that's not as bad as I thought, which was
yeah,
surprising. I think Hal is somebody who really cares about these regulations and knows a lot about them, and thought, if he's thinking that's not that bad, all right, great. And then on a kind of bigger picture level, like if you look at the thought, if you look at the shaping kind of worldview of someone like Tucker Carlson, of someone like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who, let us not forget, started out as an environmental lawyer,
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
water keeper, that was his thing. Um, these are people who have a huge amount of influence over the kind of mental direction of this administration, and who, like, I think if given dictatorial power, would do really, really cool environmental stuff, like to a degree that would be pretty far reaching, if only just because Tucker wants to be able to hunt megafauna on vast landscapes and doesn't, like, he has a very sort of renaturalized vision of how this
Mm-hmm.
country should go. And that's perhaps new for him. I think it's new for a lot of these people coming into the administration. I think a lot of them didn't think that way before.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a bullish version of it. And I'm wondering if you can just kind of give us, as in so much as you're an expert on how the agencies and the regulatory systems actually work, like some kind of middle ground prediction of where it actually all might go. Because like there's a lot of doomsaying, and I think there's a lot of fantasizing. And I think both the doomsayers and the fantasists are probably going to be disabused a little bit.
Yeah,
Is that your impression?
I think you're probably right. I think it would be so nice for someone in this country to have like a positive, um, like forward-looking vision for something like the Interior Department that
Mm-hmm.
isn't just like let's tear down this, let's tear down that, or like let's just continue with the status quo. That's kind of been what we've been, oscillating between over the last forever. I don't really see that happening with this administration. I don't think they're gonna like destroy everything and like all the endangered species are gonna go extinct and the public lands are gonna get sold off unless Utah wins its long shot lawsuit. But if I had to put money on anything, I would say it would probably be a continuation of the first term, probably with less overt like corruption, which kind of plagued them last time, like ethical violations and scandals around ethics and things. But so because I think Hal's right about that. Like it could have been a lot worse, and he seems sort of like a bit of a middle of the road type. But I I don't really see them using the Interior Department in like the way that one imagined Thomas Massey might have used the Agricultural Department. I hate to say it, but um, on the other hand, I think they recognize, kind of going back to everything we started with, like, the West. In particular, like really couldn't exist as it is now without the federal government.
Mhm.
Like especially like the Bureau of Reclamation,
Right.
all the water, the grazing programs. Like, so I think the federal government will never be like dislodged from the American West. It's too integral to how it operates and like how this civilization has been built.
Yeah.
Um, and so it is sort of like that the government will always be part of it. Our democratic voice hopefully will always be able to shape the decisions it makes. But yeah, I don't really see for interior. I don't know though. I'm going to be paying very close attention, and
Yeah.
hopefully I'll be surprised by what they do.
Well, I think that's a good place to leave it since Ashley has to run. Thank you so much. We should have you more. Um,
Thanks, James. It was really fun.